I want to tell you about the summer of 1847 at Knot, because it was a remarkable summer in the way that history books mark remarkable things. No great battle was fought, no treaty signed, no event that anyone outside of one small Tennessee valley would ever have cause to remember. It was remarkable only in the way that certain summers are remarkable to the people who live inside them. The way heat and light and the particular quality of late afternoon shadow can conspire to make ordinary life feel like something you want to hold in both hands and never put down. That was the summer I fell in love with Eleanor Whitfield, and that was the summer that began the longest and most painful education of my life. The education in what love costs when the world has decided it belongs to someone else. That MY name is James. I was 22 years old that summer, the son of a good but modest family who farmed a respectable stretch of land in the valley below the Whitfield estate. My father was a careful man, a man who understood his place in the order of things and had made his peace with it, and he had raised me to understand mine. We were not poor. We were not rich. We were the particular kind of descent that exists in the middle distance between those two things, visible to both and belonging entirely to neither. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled, because this story has been waiting a long time to travel. It has been sitting in my chest for more years than I care to count, and it needs to find the people who understand what it means to love someone with everything you have and watch the world take them from you anyway. The Whitfield were the kind of family that a valley like ours organized itself around. Old money, old name, a house that sat at the top of the hill above the rest of us with the particular authority of things that have been in one place long enough to start believing the place belongs to them. Cornelius Whitfield, Eleanor's father, was a man of considerable standing and considerably more opinion, the kind of man who wore his wealth the way other men wore their Sunday best, with a consciousness of being observed and a satisfaction in the observation. Eleanor was nothing like him. I want you to understand that from the very beginning, because it is the most important fact in everything that follows. Eleanor Whitfield was the one thing in that household that had not been shaped entirely by money and expectation and the crushing weight of a family's determination to perpetuate itself in a particular image. She had her mother's eyes, dark and quick, and her mother's laugh, which arrived without warning and departed just as suddenly, and something else entirely her own, a quality of attention, of genuine present engagement with the world and the people in it, that no amount of wealth or breeding could have manufactured. She had been educated beyond what most considered appropriate for a young woman of that era, her mother's doing, a quiet act of rebellion that Cornelius had permitted because he considered accomplishment in a daughter a form of decoration, something to be displayed at the right moments and put away when it became inconvenient. Eleanor had other ideas about what her education was for that I met her at the river, not at a dance or a church social or any of the sanctioned occasions where young people of different stations were permitted to encounter each other under the watchful eyes of people paid to ensure nothing interesting happened. At the river on a Tuesday morning in June, when I was fishing the bend below the willow grove, and she came around the curve of the bank with her boots in her hand and a book under her arm and the particular expression of a person who has escaped something and is savoring the escape. She did not see me immediately. She sat down on the bank 20 feet away and opened her book and began to read with her bare feet in the grass, and her hair coming loose from its pins in a way hair does when it has been confined too long and is making its own small rebellion. That I sat very still because I did not want to startle her, and because, if I am honest, I did not want the moment to end. After a while she looked up and found me watching, and she did not startle. She looked at me with those dark quick eyes and said, "Are you catching anything?" I said I had been until she arrived. She smiled. Not the performed social smile of a young woman of her station meeting a stranger. A real one, surprised out of her, arriving and departing in the way her mother's laugh did. She looked back at her book, and then she looked up again and said, "What does that mean exactly, Dot?" I said it meant the fish had heard her coming. She said that was the least convincing explanation she had ever been offered, and would I like to try again. Dot I set down my fishing pole. And we talked for 2 hours on the bank of that river with her feet in the grass and the summer light moving through the willows above us. And by the time she stood to leave, I understood that something had happened that was going to be very difficult to happen. She came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. All that summer we met at the river, never by explicit arrangement, always with the particular electricity of something that both parties are pretending is accidental. We talked about everything, books and farming and the nature of things, and the way the valley looked at different hours of the day, and what we believed and what we doubted and what we wanted from the years ahead of us. We talked the way people talk when they have found someone who makes the world make more sense than it did before, that I fell in love with her somewhere in the middle of all that talking without being able to identify the exact moment, which is how it always happens when it is real. There is no single instant. There's just a slow and total accumulation until one afternoon you look at the person across from you and understand that you have been in love for some time already, and the only thing that has changed is that you now know I told her on the last Tuesday of August. The light was the specific gold of late summer, the kind that makes everything it touches look like a painting of itself. She was sitting with her knees up and her arms around them, and she was looking at the river, and I looked at her profile and the loosened hair and the bare feet in the grass, and I said, "Eleanor, I love you." She was quiet for a long time, and then she turned and looked at me with those dark eyes, and they were full of something complicated and true, and she said, "I know. I have known for a while." And she reached across the grass and took my hand and held it. She did not say the words back. Not that day. But the way she held my hand said everything the words would have said and more, that I walked home that evening through the gold light feeling like the luckiest man in Tennessee. I had no idea what was already being arranged in the house at the top of the hill. Stay with me. Because what Eleanor's father had been quietly planning all that summer while we sat by the river, the arrangement he had already put into motion without telling his daughter a single word of it, is the thing that will break your heart before this story has a chance to heal. Autumn came to the valley like a warning. The trees on the hillside above the Whitfield house turned gold and red, and the light changed from summer's generous warmth to something thinner and more conditional, the particular light of a season that knows it is running out of time. I noticed it without understanding what it meant. I was too full of the summer to read the signs correctly. Eleanor and I still met at the river through September, though less frequently now, the approach of autumn bringing with it the social obligations of her world that summer's informality had allowed her to escape. But when we met, the quality between us had changed, deepened, became something that we both understood required a name and a decision, and eventually a confrontation with the reality of our different positions in the valley's careful hierarchy. I had already spoken to my father. He had listened to me with the patient expression of a man who had been expecting this conversation and had been hoping it would not arrive. He did not say what I was asking was impossible. He was too honest for false comfort. He said it would be difficult. He said Cornelius Whitfield was not a man who made decisions based on sentiment. He said if I intended to pursue this, I needed to be prepared for what that pursuit would cost. I told him I was prepared. He looked at me with the eyes of a man who knew the difference between being prepared and believing you were prepared, and said, "I hope so, son." That I sent a formal letter to Cornelius Whitfield in the first week of October requesting a meeting to discuss his daughter. The letter was carefully written, honest about my situation, clear about my intentions, and as dignified as I could make it. I worked on it for 3 evenings. My mother had read it twice and suggested 2 changes and wept quietly after she handed it back. Cornelius Whitfield received me in his study the following Thursday. IT was a large room designed to make visitors feel small. Dark wood paneling and heavy furniture, and a desk the size of a small boat behind, which Cornelius sat with the expression of a man conducting a transaction he has already decided the outcome of. He was a large man going to heaviness in his 60s, with white hair and the ruddy coloring of someone accustomed to being warm and well-fed and entirely comfortable. He looked at me across the vast desk with eyes that were not unkind, but were entirely certain that he let me speak. He gave me that. He sat and listened to everything I had to say, my intentions, my prospects, the land I stood to inherit, my character and reputation in the valley, my love for his daughter, and my belief that she returned it. He listened to all of it with his hands folded on the desk and his expression unchanged. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. James, I appreciate your candor, and I will match it with my own. Eleanor has been promised. The words landed in the room like something heavy dropped from a height, that I stared at him. He continued, evenly and without cruelty, the way a man delivers information he considers simply factual. He had entered into an arrangement with the Hargrove family of Nashville the previous spring. Their eldest son, a man named Frederick, was 28 years old, a lawyer of good standing and considerable future prospects, from a family of appropriate station and reputation. The arrangement had been made with full consideration of Eleanor's well-being and future security. It was, in Cornelius Whitfield's estimation, an excellent match, and one that any reasonable young woman in Eleanor's position should consider herself fortunate to make. He had told Eleanor about it the previous week, that I felt the floor shift under my feet. She had known. For weeks she had known, and she had not told me. And then I understood immediately why she had not told me. Because telling me would have made it real in a way that not telling me allowed her to defer, and deferment was the only mercy available to either of us in that moment. That I asked Cornelius Whitfield if Eleanor had consented. He looked at me with the particular expression of a man who considers the question itself a form of impertinence. That my daughter, he said, understands her responsibilities to this family. That I stood up. I thanked him for his time. I walked out of that study and down the wide hallway and out the front door of that house and down the hill road, and I did not stop walking until I reached the river, our river, the bend below the willow grove, where everything had begun, and I sat down on the bank and I stared at the water, and the pain that moved through me was so complete and so physical that I could not have told you where it lived in my body, because it lived everywhere simultaneously. Eleanor found me there. I do not know how she knew. I think perhaps she had been watching from the house. She came down the hill in a dark green cloak, and she came around the bend of the bank, and she saw me, and her face did what faces do when they've been holding something terrible in place with enormous effort, and suddenly the person they have been holding it away from is right there in front of them. She sat down beside me. She did not speak immediately. She took my hand in both of hers the way she had on that last Tuesday in August, and she held it with a grip that said everything her voice was not yet ready to say. "James," she said at last, her voice barely above the sound of the water. "I am so sorry that I looked at her." I looked at her face, which was doing the thing it did when she was trying not to cry, the specific tightening around the eyes and the deliberate steadiness of breath. She was not succeeding. "Did you know?" I asked. "Before last week. Did you know it was coming?" She shook her head. Her voice broke slightly on the first word. "I swear to you I did not. Not until he called me into the study and told me it was already done, that the arrangements were made, that Frederick Hargrove was coming to call in November, and that I was to receive him appropriately. The river moved past us, indifferent and continuous." "What did you say to him?" I asked, her hands tightened on mine. "I told him I would not. I told him I had feelings for someone else. I told him—" Her voice broke completely for a moment, and then she gathered it back. "I told him I loved you. I said your name in that study, and I said I loved you, and I said I would not marry a man I did not choose." And he said, I asked, though I already knew the answer, he said I was a child who did not understand the world. He said love was a feeling and feelings past, and that what endured was security and position and the kind of future that a sensible marriage provided. He said that Frederick Hargrove could give me everything, and that you— her voice went very quiet— that you could give me nothing that mattered. The cruelty of those last 3 words settled between us in the autumn air, that I looked at the river for a long time. "That I love you, Eleanor," I said. I said it plainly and directly, and without any performance of nobility, because there was no nobility available to me in that moment. "I love you, and I am asking you to choose me. Whatever that costs, whatever your father says or does, I am asking you to choose me." She was crying now, the tears she had been holding back finally coming, running silently down her face in the way of someone who is deeply ashamed of the relief that crying brings. "James," she whispered, "I want to. You have to know that I want to. But my mother is not well. If I defy him, if I cause a rupture in this family, she is the one who will suffer for it. He will make sure of that. You do not know how he is behind those walls. You only see what he shows the valley." I looked at her face, wet with tears, and I understood something that made the pain worse and more complex than it had already been. She was not choosing Frederick Hargrove. She was choosing her mother, and there was nothing in the world I could say to that or not go anywhere. Because what happens at the November meeting with Frederick Hargrove, and what Eleanor does that night afterward, is the part that will absolutely destroy you. And you need to hear it. Stay. November arrived cold and gray and relentless. I knew the date of Frederick Hargrove's first visit because the valley knew it, the way small places always know the significant events of their prominent families, through the particular osmosis of proximity and attention. The 14th of November. I marked it in my mind the way you mark something you're dreading, not with any clear idea of what you will do with the information, but with the helpless compulsion to be aware of it happening. I worked that day. I worked with the specific ferocity of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts, splitting wood and mending fence, and doing every physical task on the farm I could find until my arms shook and my breath came ragged, and still the thoughts were faster than the work. That evening I sat on the porch of my family's farmhouse, and I watched the lights in the Whitfield house at the top of the hill, and I tried not to imagine what was happening inside those lit windows. I tried and I failed, and the failing was its own particular kind of suffering. It was nearly 10 o'clock when I heard footsteps on the farm road. She came out of the dark in her green cloak, her hair loose, her face flushed from the cold and from something else. And she stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at me, and the expression on her face was one I had never seen there before. It was not sadness, and it was not defeat. It was something harder and more frightening than either of those things. That it was the expression of a person who has made a decision they cannot unmake. "James," she said, "may I come in?" I took her inside. My parents were already in bed. I led her to the kitchen, and I put the kettle on the fire, and I stood across the table from her and waited. She told me about Frederick Hargrove. He was, she said, exactly what she had expected and worse than she had feared. Not cruel, not in any overt way that she could point to and name, but a man so thoroughly convinced of his own correctness, so entirely comfortable in the assumption that the world and the people in it existed primarily in relation to his own requirements, that his pleasantness had a quality of performance about it, a thing switched on for the occasion and available to be switched off when the occasion no longer required it. He had looked at her the way her father looked at the good horses, appraisingly, with the satisfaction of a man inspecting a purchase he has already decided to make. Her father had watched the whole evening with the particular contentment of a man whose arrangements are proceeding according to plan. Her mother had sat in the corner of the parlor with a fixed smile and eyes that never quite reached the warmth they were performing, and had said almost nothing for 3 hours. When Frederick Hargrove left, he had taken Eleanor's hand and bowed over it with an ease that told her he had done this before with other young women at other arranged evenings, and that she was one in a sequence and not, in any meaningful way, distinct from the others. She told me all of this in the kitchen in a voice that was very steady and very quiet, and when she finished, she looked at me across the table with those dark eyes, and she said, "I cannot do it, James. I've tried to find a way to accept it, and I cannot. I know what I told you about my mother. I know the cost. But I sat in that parlor tonight, and I watched that man look at me, and I understood that the life waiting for me in his house will hollow me out completely, and there will be nothing left of me worth saving to him." Why hands gripped the edge of the table. She reached across and put her hands over mine. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because I need you to know that whatever happens next, it is not because I do not love you. It is not because I have chosen him. I have not chosen him, and I will not choose him. But I also cannot run. Not yet. Not while my mother is as she is. There are things I have to do first. Letters I have to write. Arrangements that have to be made quietly and carefully. I am asking you to wait for me, James. I am asking you to trust me." I looked at her hands over mine. The fire in the kitchen hearth. The steam begins to rise from the kettle. The whole ordinary domestic scene of a life we did not yet have. "I will wait," I said, "as long as it takes." She left before midnight, slipping back up the hill road in the dark, and I stood on the porch and watched the green cloak disappear into the night, and I held her words in my chest like something fragile and irreplaceable. "As long as it takes." I did not know how long it would take. I did not know the shape of what was coming, the particular cruelty of it, the way it would stretch and distort time, until waiting became its own kind of life, its own landscape with its own particular features. Winter settled in. The letters between us continued. passed through my cousin Margaret, who had no love for Cornelius Whitfield and no hesitation in serving as our courier. Eleanor's letters were careful and brave, and full of the thing I loved most about her, the direct intelligence that could not be suppressed even by the most difficult of circumstances. She wrote that Frederick Hargrove was calling regularly, that her father's satisfaction was increasing, that her mother's health had worsened through December, that she was frightened for her, that she was making her preparations as carefully and quietly as she could, and that she needed more time. That I wrote back. I always wrote back. I told her I was here. I told her I was waiting. I told her that whatever she needed to do, I trusted her to do it, and that my answer to every question she might need to ask me was yes. Christmas has passed. The New Year came. 1848 arrived with a particular bitterness of cold that the older farmers said they had not seen in 20 years. And then in the second week of January, the letters stopped. 1 week has passed. Then, too, I wrote to Margaret. Margaret wrote back that she had not seen Eleanor in 10 days, that the Whitfield house had a closed and shuttered quality she could not quite account for, that there were carriages she did not recognize coming and going. The third week of January, I walked up the hill road and knocked on the front door of the Whitfield house, that a servant answered. She looked at me with an expression that told me she had been given instructions about exactly this eventuality. She told me that Miss Eleanor was unavailable. I asked when she would be available. The servant, who had known me since I was a boy and who looked genuinely sorry about what she was saying, told me that Miss Eleanor had been married to Mr. Frederick Hargrove of Nashville on the 12th of January and had departed for Nashville the following morning. The world went very quiet. I stood on that porch in the January cold with the wind coming down the hill from the north, and I felt something happen inside my chest that I could not describe then and cannot describe now, except to say that it was the most total and complete pain I had ever felt, and I have felt considerable pain in my life. That I walked home, that I did not knock on that door again. I know what you're feeling right now, but please stay, because there is a letter that arrived 3 months later that explains everything, and what it contains will break you open and then put you back together. You have to hear it. Stay with me. The spring of 1848 came regardless, the world being entirely indifferent to the state of a young farmer's heart. The trees budded and the river rose with snow melt, and the fields required planting, and I did all of the things the season required of me, with the mechanical competence of a man who has decided that functioning is the most he can ask of himself for the time, being why mother watched me with eyes that understood more than she said. She fed me, and she did not ask unnecessary questions, and she occasionally placed her hand on my shoulder when she passed me at the table, and that wordless contact was more comfort than any speech she could have offered. And why father said once, quietly and without preamble, that a man can survive most things if he keeps working. I held on to that the way you hold on to something plain and true when the more elaborate comforts have failed. That I had heard nothing from Eleanor. Not a word. Not a letter through Margaret. Not a message through any channel. The silence from Nashville was total, and I had made myself stop trying to interpret it. Interpretation in the absence of information is just suffering with extra steps, and I had enough suffering without manufacturing more. And then on a morning in April, when the valley was doing everything April does with excessive and almost offensive beauty, a letter arrived. Margaret brought it herself, riding the 3 miles from town with a look on her face that told me it was important before she had said a word. She handed it to me and squeezed my arm and left without speaking, and I stood in the farmyard with the letter in my hand for a long time before I could make myself open it. Eleanor's handwriting. The same handwriting I had read through 2 winters by lamplight. But somehow, the pressure of the pen heavier, the letters more deliberate, the handwriting of someone who is writing with the full weight of everything they need to say pressing down on every stroke, that I will not give you every word of that letter. Some of it belongs only to me and to the years I've spent with it since. But I will tell you what it contained, because you need to understand what she had done and why. Her mother had been dying, not slowly and ambiguously in the way of chronic illness, but with the specific and terrifying speed of a condition that had been concealing its true severity for months. In December, her mother had been told by the physician that she had at most 6 months remaining. She had kept this from Eleanor for 3 weeks, not wanting to burden her, And when Eleanor found out, she was sitting in her mother's room at 2 in the morning, holding her hand, and her mother had told her the truth, and then said, "My darling, I need to know you will be safe before I go. I need to know what you will be provided for. I cannot leave this world in peace without knowing that." Eleanor had looked at her mother's face. The face she had loved her entire life. The face that was going away from her faster than any of them had been prepared for. And she had made the only decision she felt she could make in that moment. She had gone to her father the following morning, and she had told him she would marry Frederick Hargrove. She had asked only for one condition, that the wedding be soon enough that her mother could be present for it, soon enough that her mother could see her settled and go in the peace she had asked for. Cornelius Whitfield had not asked why. He had simply moved with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting for this agreement and had the arrangements half made already. The wedding was on the 12th of January. Her mother had been carried downstairs for it in a chair and had watched the ceremony with tears running down her face and an expression that Eleanor described as peaceful. Deeply, finally peaceful. Her mother had died on the 23rd of January, 11 days after the wedding. Eleanor wrote that she was in Nashville in a house that was comfortable and cold in equal measure. That Frederick Hargrove was not cruel. That he was what he had appeared to be in that November parlor. A man for whom she was an acquisition and whose attention, now that the acquisition was complete, had largely returned to the business of his own life and ambitions. That she was not unhappy in any dramatic way. That she was something quieter and more permanent than unhappy. She wrote that she had not contacted me through the winter because she had not had the right to. That she was a married woman and that writing to me was a thing she could not do without it being a betrayal of what little integrity she had left. That she was writing now because she needed me to know the truth, not because it changed anything. She was clear about that. "It does not change anything, James," she wrote. "I am not writing to ask for anything. I am writing because you deserve the truth, and I owe you that much at least." She wrote at the end, and these are the words I will not keep to myself because they belong to this story. She wrote, "I loved you at that river. I love you still in whatever way a woman in my situation is permitted to love a memory. I am sorry I cannot be braver. I am sorry I could not find another way. I hope you find someone who gets to love you openly and completely and without any of the cost that loving me required. You deserve that. You have always deserved that." I folded the letter. I held it in my hands. The April morning continued around me, the birds and the light and the unreasonable beauty of the valley in spring, and I sat in it and I cried. Not the sharp, desperate crying of the January porch. Something different, something that felt, underneath the grief, like the beginning of understanding. She had not abandoned me. She had made an impossible choice in an impossible moment, and she had made it for her mother, and she had paid for it with her own life's happiness, and she had done all of that without asking me to understand or forgive, because she had not believed she had the right to ask. That I sat with that for a long time. And then I wrote her back. One letter. I told her I understood. I told her I forgave her, not because she needed my forgiveness, but because I needed to give it. I told her that the summer at the river had been the finest summer of my life, and that nothing that came after it could change what it had been while it was happening. I told her I hoped she found pockets of happiness in the life she was living, small ones if not large ones, real ones wherever they could be found. I told her I would be all right, that IT was not entirely true when I wrote IT. IT became true later. Stay. Please stay. Because what happened 3 years after that letter, and the person who arrived in the valley when I had almost stopped believing arrival was possible, is the ending this story has been building toward from the very first Tuesday of the river. You have to hear it. Do not go anywhere. 3 years is a long time to rebuild a person. I say rebuild because that is what it was. Not recovery in the way of an illness, but reconstruction in the way of a structure that has been damaged at its foundations and must be taken down to the base and built back up with more careful attention to what it is actually standing on. I worked. I expanded the farm. I read in the evenings by lamplight with a seriousness of purpose that my father recognized as the specific hunger of a mind that needs to be fed or it will feed on itself. I became, in the valley's estimation, a steady and capable young man, which was another way of saying I had learned to carry what I was carrying without letting it show enough to make other people uncomfortable that I did not pursue anyone. I want to be honest about that. There were young women in the valley and in the surrounding towns who were presented to my attention through the ordinary social mechanisms of the time, and I treated them all with a courtesy that was genuine and a distance that I could not seem to help. My mother occasionally looked at me across the supper table with an expression that contained both understanding and the particular maternal concern that has no remedy except time. I heard word of Eleanor occasionally through the years. She was in Nashville. She was well by outward appearances. She had no children. Frederick Hargrove had become a judge of some local standing. The reports were always the same, comfortable, external, telling me nothing about the interior life of the woman I had known at the river that I stopped asking after a while. Some information is not useful. And then in the spring of 1851, a family came to the valley. They came from Virginia, a widower named Thomas Calloway, and his sister, a woman of 26 named Iris, who had come west with him to help establish his new farm after the death of his wife the previous year. They settled in the old Henderson property at the north end of the valley, and they were introduced to the community through the usual channels, and I encountered Iris Calloway for the first time at a church social in May. She was nothing like Eleanor. I want to say that plainly and without any implication that nothing like Eleanor was a deficiency. It was not. It was simply true. Where Eleanor had been dark and quick and full of a restless intelligence that was always pressing at its own boundaries, Iris was fair and quiet and possessed of a stillness that was not emptiness but depth. The stillness of water that goes down further than you can see. She had brown eyes that noticed things. She had a way of listening that made you feel heard in the specific way that is different from being merely received. She had survived something. I could see that the particular quality of a person who has been through grief and has come out the other side, not unscathed, but intact. And that quality of hard-won intactness was, I found, enormously recognizable to me, that we did not fall into conversation easily. We were both, I think, people who had learned caution, who had learned that the easiest opening is not always the wisest one. We circled each other for the better part of that spring in the way of people who are paying attention to each other, without being quite ready to admit it was her brother Thomas who forced the issue, with the cheerful tactlessness of a man who has decided that two people he likes would benefit for being less cautious. He invited me to supper at the Calloway farm on a Thursday evening in June, and then manufactured a reason to leave his own table an hour into the meal and did not return for 3 hours. Iris watched him go with an expression of resigned exasperation that I watched him go with something that was, I realized, relief that we talked for those 3 hours the way I had not talked with anyone since the river. Not about the same things. The world had changed, and we had changed, and the conversation had its own character entirely. But with the same quality of genuine engagement, the same sense of two people discovering that the other person makes the world make more sense than it did before. She told me about Virginia, about her brother's wife and the grief of losing her, about the difficulties of the move and the way a new place required you to become a slightly new version of yourself, whether you intended to or not. She told me some of what she had survived in her own life. Not all of it. Not that night, but enough that I understood she was not a person unfamiliar with the cost of things that I told her about the farm and about my parents and about the books I had been reading. I did not tell her about Eleanor that night. That came later, carefully and honestly, and with the full weight it deserved, because Iris was a person who deserved honesty and would have recognized anything less. When she heard about Eleanor, she did not flinch or withdraw. She listened to the whole of it with those deep brown eyes, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "It sounds like you loved her very well. And it sounds like she loved you the best she could in the circumstances she was given. And it sounds like you have done the honest work of understanding the difference between those two things." I looked at her. Nobody had said it like that before. Not my mother, not my father, not anyone. The clarity of it, the absence of either false comfort or unnecessary sorrow, the simple, clean accuracy of seeing something and naming it precisely as it was that I think I knew then. Not with the summer certainty of the river, but with something more durable, the particular knowing of a person who has been through enough to understand the difference between feeling and foundation. Tell me in the comments which moment in this story stayed with you the longest. Was it the river and the summer light? Was it the kitchen and her hands over mine, and as long as it takes? Was it the January porch and the servant's face? Was it the April letter and those final words? Because some of you have loved someone you could not keep. Some of you have waited by a river for a person who was not coming back and had to find your way to a life that did not include them. And if you have dealt with something similar, share your story. You are not alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life. Because here's what I want to tell you before I finish. Iris Calloway and I were married in the autumn of 1851 in a small ceremony at the Valley Church. Thomas gave her away with an expression of profound self-congratulation that was entirely justified. My mother wept in the way she wept at things she had been quietly willing into existence for a long time. My father shook my hand after the ceremony and did not say anything, but his eyes said everything. We build a life together. A genuine one, with the texture and weight of something real. We had children, 4 of them, who grew up in the farmhouse and ran in the same fields I had run in as a boy, and who filled the rooms with the particular noise and light and chaos of children who were loved well and know it that I think about Eleanor sometimes. Not with the acute pain of those first years, but with the particular tenderness you have for something that shaped you and cost you and ultimately led you by the long route. Somewhere true did I heard in 1856 that Frederick Hargrove had died of a fever. That Eleanor had returned to Millhaven for a time, and then gone east to live with a cousin. I did not seek her out. I did not think it was what either of us needed. But I wrote her a letter, a short one. I told her I hoped she was finding her way to something good. I told her I was well. I told her the valley was beautiful in autumn the way it always had been. She wrote back once. 2 lines. I'm glad you are well, James. I always knew you would be. I folded that letter, and I put it in the box with the other one, and I carry them both with me not as wounds, but as evidence. Evidence that love is real even when it cannot stay. Evidence that the people who shape us do not have to remain in order to matter. Evidence that the river was real, and the summer was real, and the hands over mine in the kitchen were real, and none of it was wasted even when it was lost. Iris found the box once, years later. She held it and looked at me, and I told her everything, every word, and she listened with those deep brown eyes, and when I finished she took my hand, not over mine the way Eleanor had, but inside mine, fingers threaded through fingers, the way of 2 people who have decided they are not letting go. She said, I am glad the river happened, because the river made you someone worth finding. That I have thought about those words more times than I can count. She was not wrong. She was never wrong about the things that mattered. And the valley in autumn is still beautiful. It always has been. It always will be. Some things the years cannot touch.